In past weeks, we've had about 40 people who are on the Zoom call. And then anywhere between 500 and 1,000 that are watching on Facebook Live.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's a lot of people, really. But that's a good thing. That's a really good thing.
Those who are entering the Zoom, we will start at 2 o'clock. Thank you for joining us. For those who are joining us in the Zoom, we will begin at 2 o'clock. So if you don't hear any audio, it's because we're not talking currently. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our town halls that prioritize the voices of intersectional Lutherans, co-sponsored by Just Lutheran and the Racial and Ethnic Ministry Strategies Discipling Team of the Sierra Pacific Synod. ASL interpretation for today's town hall is provided by Lutheran Friends of the Deaf, special events for Milnick family of organizations. I am Pastor Megan Rohrer, and I will be sharing some information about logistics at the beginning of our meeting and collecting Q&A questions for those who are joining us on Zoom and on live stream. A few logistics before we begin. If you are joining us in the Zoom webinar, you do not have access to your video or microphone. This town hall is being presented in webinar format, which may be different from other Zoom calls you've participated in. Only those presenting today will have the ability to turn on their video and microphone. Our goal is to center our hearts and minds on the voices we are listening to today. This choice will also decrease the likelihood that this Zoom space will be intentionally disrupted in harmful ways. Tonight's conversation will begin with moderated questions and then open up to questions from the audience. Because we're in webinar, there is a separate Q&A section to enter questions. Please use this space for your questions. You can also post questions online with hashtag #LutheransListen. If you want to share additional wisdom, connect communally, or introduce yourself to others, please do this in the chat room. Some may find the blinking light of the chat distracting. If you do not know how to turn off notifications for chat, you may want to just simply open the chat box and put it off to the side of your screen to get the light to stop blinking. This webinar is being recorded and will be available both on Facebook's event page and at justlutheran.com under the Online Trainings and Curriculums tab. You will receive a follow-up email if you are on Zoom with the link in case you would like to share the video with others. At the end of the town hall, a link to an evaluation survey will pop up on Zoom. If you don't have time to complete it now, do not worry. You will also receive the link via email tomorrow. Or you can use hashtag #LutheransListen on social media. If you want to review any of these logistics, they will be in the chat box. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge that sharing your voice in a town hall is a leap of faith. At some point, there may be a technology hiccup or one of my children may seek attention. Let's embrace our humanness, however we find it. And with those logistics, I will turn over our conversation to Jay Wilson.
Hello and welcome everybody. As we're talking about disability access and particularly about two kinds of bias that we call ableism and Audism. Ableism is bias affecting people who have disabilities. And like all kinds of oppression, we're talking about many different ways that oppression can happen. Audism is oppression that expects people to be hearing and speaking, and oppresses people who are deaf or non-speaking. As we're centering the voices of disabled and deaf folks today, we want to make sure to focus on some tips for how to make things more accessible. So we're going to model that today in how we're running the webinar. Some of the things that we'll be doing towards that purpose will be speaking one at a time, turning microphones off when we're not speaking so that background noise doesn't disrupt being able to hear. If we're sharing any images, I don't know that we plan to, but if we were, we would describe them. Asking people to speak slowly and wait for interpreters to catch up if we do get going too fast. Likewise, if you find we're going too fast, please let us know. You can do that in the chat, and we will slow down and repeat if needed. We're asking presenters to define any jargon, to consider cognitive accessibility and accessibility for people who are new to this conversation. I want to flag that our content today may well discuss the many ways in which oppression occurs, and that may be triggering for folks who have experienced those types of oppression. My service dog is clicking toenails here. I don't know if you can hear that. Sorry about that. And to encourage people to take care of yourselves, as we know that these topics will hit us differently. As you're attending, we encourage you to be in your body and mind in whatever way works best for you, whether you're needing to take a break for a few minutes. We can't see you anyway, so if you want to do yoga or change your clothes or take care of children or whatever you need to do in order to be present, we welcome you to do that in this space and to practice what it feels like to be people with bodies and minds, which our culture teaches us not to do. If there are any access concerns that arise as we're speaking, please do let us know in the chat, and we will pause to fix them before we move on. With that, I'm going to ask folks to introduce themselves. I can start. My name is Jay Wilson. My connection to the Sierra Pacific Synod is that I was ordained through extraordinary Lutheran ministries many years ago into a congregation in social ministry in the Sierra Pacific Synod. I also did my pastoral internship here, and so feel like coming home in some ways, even though I'm living in Minnesota and have been for many years. My current role, I work as in disability and accessibility with students at the University of Minnesota, and I also serve as a equity and diversity trainer here. My background is in doing every kind of disability work there is, from direct service to advocacy. My personal experiences, I am autistic and have health disabilities that I've had my whole life. I also have some physical disabilities and use a manual wheelchair at this point in my life. Just a note about language. I personally and other panelists may use what we call identity first language, which means that I use statements like I'm disabled. In many parts of disability community, there are different ways of using language. Some people prefer what's called person first, where we say like a person with autism or a person with a disability. Other people, also coming from a disability and civil rights perspective, prefer identity first language. And so we welcome people to use whatever language you are more comfortable using about yourself and to be aware of the language that we're using about others. Loretta, would you like to introduce yourself next? And then Kay after that?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Loretta Murray, and I am Executive Director of Milneck Services in Milneck, New York. I am a person with a disability, and I am a late deafened adult. So I have not been deaf my entire life, but more than half of my life I have been. I also consider myself that I say I am a person with a disability, but I will use any type of phrase that's necessary to get my points across. I've had the privilege of serving in my own church community as an accessibility officer and helping various bishops to provide accessibility for different congregations. It's a pleasure again to be here, and I'll turn over to the next panelist.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kay Harrelson, and I am not a person with a disability. However, I was born into a family of disabilities of varying kinds. First of all, my father, who was actually born in 1919, had severe dyslexia and was not allowed to go to school after 3rd grade because he was too dumb to learn how to read. Actually, a very, very brilliant person. I was the oldest of 4 children, and my brother, my only brother, had spinal meningitis at age of 9 months, and it destroyed his auditory nerve, so he was profoundly deaf most of his life. And when my mother passed away, then I, at age 15, became sort of the surrogate mother for all of these kids, other children, and that's kind of how my life started out. Then I got married, and my husband had physical defects. He had congenital heart problems, and his father used a brace because of polio, and his brother had mental disabilities as a result of having had measles. My mother always wanted me to teach the deaf, but I wasn't really interested in that. But my husband became very close friends with my brother, and we came to California so that he could go to school at Northridge and become a teacher of deaf and hard of hearing children youth. So, so there's a whole lot of stuff in there. And he ended up getting his first teaching job in deaf and hard of hearing in Porterville, California, working for the Tulare County Department of Education. Tulare County is also the home of what is known today as the Porterville Developmental Center. And that's where my life, really truly working with disabilities, took off, because I started working at Porterville, what was known as Porterville State Hospital at the time, as a part-time teacher in skilled nursing units for adults with very severe physical disabilities. All of them were nonverbal, and I hadn't a clue what I was doing. I learned very quickly. I have worked, then I went to work for the state of California at Porterville State Hospital, and I have been employed in a number of different jobs over the years since 1978 in developmental services for the state of California. Currently, I'm the education administrator for the education programs for people in the state developmental centers, and also via contract Department of State Hospitals. And so I work with the state hospitals. But along with that, because of that, I've had a lot of experience with a whole lot of different disabilities, which is really a major benefit, I think, in just having the ability to have lots and lots of friends and lots of different kinds of friends. And it gives you a perspective about life that I think is much more positive than it might be otherwise. One of the, so anyway, basically that's who I am and where I come from. So who wants to go next and who they are?
Hi, I'm Pastor Brian Kraus. I have cerebral palsy, and I also have mental health issues. I've got depression and anxiety. I think it's important that I also name those as part of my disability, my identity, because those especially are things that are often hidden in our society. And there were a lot of people walking around with anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues that they're stigmatized, and we don't talk about it, and a lot of the time they don't get the help they deserve and the recognition that they need. So I always want to include my mental health issues as part of my identity as a person with a disability. I've served congregations in Nebraska and in Ohio. Right now, I am not currently working. I'm looking for work. I was serving the last 2 years as a hospice chaplain for Heartland Hospice, but when COVID hit, my job got really decreased to very few hours, and so I left. And part of it was my mental health issues, scared of the future, didn't know what was going on. So yeah, now I'm trying to start a new job somewhere, get going again after the fear that I had in March when I left my job. I am currently the current interim chair of disability ministries at the ELCA. I say current interim chair because there's, I think it's 6 of us on the committee, and we just kind of passed the chairmanship around because we're all very wise and competent people who could lead, and we just decided that someone would be chair for 6 months and pass it on to somebody else for 6 months. So nothing special about me that I'm the current chair, just I volunteered to take it for this 6-month period, starting July through the end of the year. So that's where I'm working. I'm working in the church-wide office. I was some people may know me that I was a person at the church-wide assembly in Pittsburgh that stood up when we were debating the campaign for the ELCA, and I requested that a goal be added for disability ministries. It was not a goal in the campaign at the beginning, but I requested that that goal be added, and we have received money from that and have been doing some wonderful things. But what I'm really here to talk about today is who I am and how I experience the church in the world as a person with cerebral palsy and mental health issues.
I can go next. My name is Rebecca Turnbaugh. I am the Assistant Director of Community Organizing at St. John's Lutheran Church in Sacramento. So that's my contact. St. John's is, unsurprisingly for the ELCA, a predominantly white congregation and a fairly, I would say, financially stable or affluent congregation. That's the context that I work in. Me, myself, I am a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman who also has a disability. I was paralyzed at 8 months old and use a manual wheelchair. So that's just some of the intersectionality of my identity and the context that I come from.
Thanks. Ashanti, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. My name is Ashanti Mons Trevia, excuse my language. I'm a deaf person. That's how I identify. I use ASL as my primary communication. I am a BIPOC. I reside in Washington State. I'm a PhD student currently in Ryan Troyer's PhD program. That's the CIS program. I work for Cascadia Deaf Nation, and we just focus on empowerment of Black people in the deaf community, because in Washington State, there's been issues that have been mostly north, very deep, and they're really intense, hot topics. So, and this is showing how it impacts our community as well. So I've been doing different kinds of discussions with Black deaf people in the community, and also relating to racism and how we confront it and how it's been so oppressive in our community. So last year, I ran for city council. And this is also for Cascadia Deaf Nation in my town where I live. I think it's Bellingham. So it was trying to focus on truths about how oppression are affecting everybody systemically. It's especially autism, racism. I mean, the degrees vary, how systemic racism has been rampant in the community. And I know a lot of people aren't comfortable having these discussions, but the importance is dire. And we have to get to where we see this as a priority discussion. The systematic racism has been rampant in our community, and we have to figure out how we internalize that and how we unpack it. And a lot of people don't even recognize that they have internalized racism. So getting to the place where we recognize that, how much it affects us, how much it hurts the community and groups that we serve, has been, especially BIPOCs, Black interpreter people of color and Indigenous people of color, it has made an extreme impact on them. So in the Black deaf community in Washington State, that's been a hot topic. We're trying to make this our primary work in Cascadia Deaf Nation. There's many white organizations that serve deaf and hard of hearing communities. I would say most of them have let go of the Black deaf, professional consortium because they just can't identify as well as we could. So after that, all of the things that have been happening and everything that's been racially charged, we're trying to figure out how to set up an opportunity for systematic racism to be completely excluded from our dialogue, and how we can confront it head on. We're doing a lot of investigation of internal biases as well, and how that affects the communities that we serve. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks everybody for introducing yourselves, and the folks' introductions were a great start to thinking about our next question. How the intersections of our identities, thinking specifically about intersectional identities, where we experience oppression as well as areas where we experience privilege, shape the way that we are in the church, the way that we are Lutheran, or other ways that we may identify as parts of the church. Would anyone like to start with that question?
I can start there. I've been a Christian all my life. I grew up in a small town in southeastern Washington, and actually my mother was from Bellingham, Ashante. So anyway, so we have some things in common there, but I'm in a very small town, and there were two churches, the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church. and the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, actually what it was. My mother was raised Methodist. My dad was raised nothing, but most of his relatives were Catholic. But my mom always took us to church. My brother didn't go because he didn't understand what was going on there. It was very small, but he didn't understand anything, and so he just didn't go. My dad didn't go for about the same reason. He didn't understand. He couldn't read, and he was embarrassed, and so he didn't want to go to church. But you know, my dad and my brother both were turned out to be very, very Christian people. And my brother, as he was older, and part of that deaf community in Washington State, became very connected with the church there. I became a Lutheran when I married one, but I've been very comfortable with the Lutheran Church. And I've also been very fortunate because I have been able to associate with people within my church family who were willing to grow and move forward with relationships with people. One of the things that we have to understand is that we all have biases, even if we don't always recognize them. And it's really important, I think, for us from a Christian perspective to examine our own biases and kind of figure out where we're coming from. And then when we do that, we can through our Christianity move forward in helping other people by example. One of the things that we have to do is look, it's not what people say so much as observing them and watching what they do. And when you work for a state government, you have to be pretty careful about the religious thing because of the separation of church and state. But you can communicate about people and how you should treat people and how we need to include all people. Because, when you think about disabilities or differently abled, every single person in the world is differently abled. So what we need to do, what we did at Porterville Developmental Center was when we were looking for a mission statement, and what we came up with is building capabilities and independence. Keep in mind that we had, as residents of our facility, about 1,200 individuals who were very, very disabled, very serious developmental disabilities, and there was a large range of things, and many of them placed in the institution and left by their families there. And we even, when I started there, still had in some of the records there that the families were to be notified only when their family member passed away, because there was a time in our country when people who had severe developmental disabilities, particularly what was then known as mental retardation and some other things, historical things before that, it was an embarrassment and those people were put away. Thank God we don't do that anymore. And but there are still biases. I know that I have a dear friend who has pretty serious cerebral palsy, and he's just smart as he can be. And observing people talking to him in a condescending way. And I think as I've been thinking about this presentation, I was thinking about the fact that we need to really look and educate, because sometimes biases are the result of a person's ability to comprehend and understand, and sometimes it's motivation, and a lot of it depends on how people were raised and where they come from. Change comes slowly. Unfortunately, it's always with us, but the things we really want to happen come very slowly. I remember when I was in high school in the late 50s, and I graduated from high school in 1962 and went through college during the first civil rights movement. And we all thought, all of us young people who were just, the new generation, boy, we were going to take care of that mess. Well, it didn't really happen like it should have. It's almost like we got stalled along the way somewhere. But I think that the ability to model behavior and to demonstrate, and then to take, is going to help us as we take proactive things. When I was in Porterville, we had a situation where one of the larger homes operated by Good Shepherd Lutheran Home was closing, and they were moving their residents into group home. And they came to our church and wanted to know if we would set up a separate worship service, Sunday school kind of a thing for their residents to place to come to church. And our pastor called me and he said, Kay, he said, I told them no, that we wouldn't do that. But if they would like to come and work with us and we could set up a way that their people could attend our church as members of the church and active participants in everything and not as separate, that we would be interested in doing that. And so that's exactly what we did. And we put together a really nice program. We called it Adults 2. And we had Sunday school classes for them. And then we had members of the congregation who volunteered that we did training for, who actually sat scattered through the congregation, because we didn't want people sitting in the back row. You know, this is the handicapped row. We didn't want a handicapped row in church, handicapped in church. And we did some training. One of the things that came up, and this is kind of where the bias comes, you know, if you're Lutheran, you know, you have to go to class and you have to do confirmation or some kind of an adult class or something. And the pastor said, he said, we've got some members of this church who are not going to want these folks to take communion because they haven't been trained and maybe they can't be trained. So we had classes. And our classes were great things. Like we met in their home with them, the pastor's wife and I met in their home, and we learned how to pass the offering plate. We learned how to take communion out of a cup without washing the cup. You know, we had plastic cups, they don't break the cups. And then we went into the church and we practiced. We practiced going to the communion rail. We practiced all those things. And then we talked a lot about what communion was and family was. Now, keep in mind, all these people were nonverbal. There were about 5 of them and they were nonverbal. But one of the things we all have to understand is that because the person doesn't have expressive language, doesn't mean they don't have comprehensive language. And we don't know what people understand always. And so we have to go. And I always said, you know, all we can do is provide the opportunity and let God take care of the rest. And the ladies in the church, I was just floored, because when we finally we're ready for our first communion, all of these people that we thought were going to give us trouble set up this big party, and everybody was welcomed and handshaking and a big party for their first communion. And it worked out really well. I think those kinds of things where we can overtly educate people. I mean, people need to be educated, because a lot of times people's behavior towards others is because they don't know. And we have to take care of that. So that's my main.
Thanks, Kay, for sharing some of your experiences of integrating folks into congregation, the full life of congregations. Did other folks have anything that they would like to share about how your own identity or experiences shape how you show up in congregations, or how you experience being Lutheran, or other ways of identifying your faith?
I would. I'm a practicing Catholic, and I have been all my life. And I live in Brooklyn for many years. I live in Brooklyn, New York, which is, if anybody knows anything about Brooklyn, it is known as the city of churches, because there are churches on every street throughout the borough of all different denominations. And as I said before, I was hearing for the first half of my life, and then I became deaf. And I noticed immediately how excluded I was from religious life. There wasn't a provision for interpreters. There wasn't provision for captioning in church. I can read the missalette, but I don't understand what the minister is saying when he's talking about, after the gospel. It's all gone. So for many years, I said, you know what? Unless I'm accommodated, I'm not going. What's the point? I don't feel welcome. And a lot of people in the community feel the same way. And that's sad. So, finally I found myself going back, and I said, okay, let me figure out how this can work. So, ask the pastor for interpreters. Maybe not every Sunday, but, one Sunday a month. And do things, and that's what I was doing. And also asking for other types of accommodations, open captions. I mean, we fail to realize that 1/5 of the individuals that come to any church are people with disabilities. 20%. Now, they may not be open and, readily visible to you, but they are there. And what are we doing to make those individuals feel welcome? We might not be doing enough. There should be something where each parish or each congregation sets up a minister assistant to work with accommodations or to welcoming. I mean, for those individuals who have young children with severe disabilities, I venture to guess that many of them would welcome having some respite, and some parish members would help them, every once in a while, and just give the parents a little bit of a break and watch their children. Part of what I think is very strongly is that no one, unless we're all welcome into church, then we're all not welcome. And really, we're all children of God. We've all been baptized into Jesus. And each one of us is an equal. And to be honest with you, especially, and this is just my opinion, but sometimes I work with very severely disabled adults, deaf and other disabilities. And so many times I feel when I'm working with them that I'm working with angels. To me, they're a gift. And if those individuals were in our parishes, various members of the parish might feel the same way. The last thing I wanted to say is that I was a member, I was a former executive director of an independent living center in Harlem. And I learned very quickly about institutional and bias when I worked there. I will tell you, all of my staff, some were Afro-American, some were Asian, whatever, but my very close friends were Afro-American. And I would walk out into the street with them, And I would see people looking at me differently, like, what's wrong? And I remember once visiting a congregation up in Harlem. And I asked if they wanted to have interpreters at their mass. And I was told, no, there are no deaf people here. No. I said, that's statistically impossible. There has to be deaf people here in this area. I said, but if they're not coming, it's because they're not welcome. The last thing I'd like to say is I often look at this as accessibility in churches as one of my favorite movies, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come.
Would any of the other panelists like to speak to this question?
I would like to speak. One of my earliest memories from church, maybe not my earliest, but I remember the time I went to confirmation camp. I grew up in the Lutheran Church all my life. I went to confirmation camp in middle school, like a lot of other middle school students in the Lutheran Church. And the first night I was at confirmation camp in the cabin, but probably 9 other boys and the camp counselor. I was laying there in bed, and one of the other boys came and patted me on the head, and then he got back in his bunk. And I was laying there in bed, I felt something heavy in my hair, and I had to get up. Like, what did he just do to me? Found that he had put toothpaste in my hair. Very first night of confirmation camp, I, the one boy in the cabin with the disability and with my cerebral palsy, and they had already pulled a prank on me. That week, I did not feel like I was welcomed at confirmation camp. I felt excluded. And I almost hate to say this, but I grew up in the Boy Scouts. I went camping once a month as a youth. Middle school, high school, I was camping all the time. I felt more welcomed by the Boy Scouts than I did at a church camp. And that's hard to say that, the church is supposed to be this loving, welcoming place. But when I went to confirmation camp, I felt like I was the boy in the cabin that had been singled out to be picked on and excluded. And I did not have a good experience at confirmation camp. Growing up, sometimes I think it's amazing that I went all the way to becoming an ordained minister. Because I have had some negative experiences in the church. When I was in seminary, I participated in the deep healing prayer group, and there were some people in the deep healing prayer group that were of the idea that to get healed from something, you had to confess your sin to God. And they asked to pray for my healing from cerebral palsy. And they wanted me to confess to God the sin for which I was being punished. And, this is in a Lutheran church, one of our ELCA Lutheran church, where this idea, and this was unfortunately a lay-led group, and maybe if a pastor had been more involved, it wouldn't have been that way. But they wanted me to confess the sin for which God was punishing me with cerebral palsy. So there was this idea running around, though it doesn't fit into our theology, that somehow disabilities are caused by sin, that people who are disabled are being punished by God. They would just confess and God would heal them. I've even been told at times that God won't heal me because I have a selfish need to be pitied. Horrible. Someone actually told me that. God would not heal me because I have a selfish desire to be pitied. So I've experienced a lot of painful things in the church. And And another thing that I've experienced that's painful is the people who tell me how wonderful I am. And you say, well, why would that be painful? We talked, somebody mentioned a minute ago, people with disabilities being angels. From my experience, whenever somebody wanted to imply that I was an angel or sent from God or some blessing, that was a person that was uncomfortable with my presence. They wanted to get out of the room. And frankly, I have had no other relationships with those people. They say nice things to your face, but inside they're very uncomfortable about your presence. They're trying to be nice, but they never become your friends. So whether people think I'm sinful and I'm being punished by God, or whether they think I'm a gift and an angel and heaven sent, neither one of those has been a positive experience. So I just want to say, mention that whether they call me a demon or whether they call me an angel, neither one is a good thing in my experience. I just want to be seen as a human being. And I have my limitations like other people have, and I have my gifts like other people have. I'm a human being. I'm not a demon, a devil. I'm not an angel. I'm not some special gift from God. I'm a human being. And I think one reason that I am Lutheran and why I continue to be Lutheran is because of our theology. In the Lutheran Church, we embrace paradoxes. And for those of you who don't know what a paradox is, it's when you hold two things that seem to be contradictory together, hold them both to be true. For me, I am a white male, so I'm privileged, but I also have cerebral palsy and mental health issues. So I have some aspects about me that are that oppress me, and I can hold both of those together, and it's not contradictory or weird. It's just part of life that we have many things in our lives that seem contradictory but are both true at the same time, that can be privileged and also oppressed at the same time. It's just kind of funny, but it's very true in my life. One thing I will say that I just absolutely love about being Lutheran is that we, and this is true of all mainline denominations, I'm not saying just Lutherans, but we really do see the humanity in all people. And we reach out, and our theology really welcomes all people. And I say that because there is a segment of the Christian church that's really focused on this idea that you've got to make a personal commitment to Jesus. You've got to ask Jesus to be in your heart as your personal Lord and Savior. And if you really scratch the surface of those denominations and go a little deeper, you start asking questions about, okay, well, what about people who can't make that personal decision? A lot of them just don't have time for people with disabilities. If somebody can't make that conscious decision, then they're just seen as, they're already saved, or we don't really need to spend time with that population. We're really about reaching out to the people who can make the choice. But as Lutherans, we don't view it that way. We view that everybody is in need of knowing God's love. So even if they're in a bed and they can't communicate, we would still go in the room and we'd hold their hand and we would sit there with them. Maybe sing a hymn, or share Bible. We don't ignore people just because they don't respond. We go in the room and we say all people need to know the love of God for them. And that's what makes me really proud to be a Lutheran, that we don't shy away from those people that many find uncomfortable. We go into a room and we say, you are a beloved child of God. Jesus Christ died for you. He loves you, and I want you to know that you are loved. So I'm really proud of being a Lutheran, even though, I did share that I've had some negative experiences in the church. I also see a lot of positive. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Definitely want to echo the themes of dehumanization, which I think is a big undercurrent in a lot of the ways that oppression works in the church and in society as well. I'm seeing comments both from Loretta and Megan that they have also experienced attempts at faith healing for different reasons. I have as well. One of the ways in which I've experienced it is out in the world using my wheelchair, that folks will come up without consent, without conversation, and ask to do faith healing in ways that aren't in line with my theology or my experience of the world, and can be very invasive in that. Rebecca, Shanti, did either of you have things that you wanted to add about this question or other things you wanted to say?
Yeah, I will, unless Ashanti wants to go right now. I really resonated a lot with what Pastor Brian said. You know, I'm relatively new to the Lutheran Church, so I don't know that I hold that identity as deeply as some others here. But one thing that I've really come to deeply appreciate a piece of theology from the Lutheran Church is that we are always and all times both sinners and saints. And that helps me to have a more integrated perspective of myself and of others. Because in past faith communities that I was raised in were sort of, I think, Jay, as you alluded to in some of your introductory remarks, sort of living more in a binary. And we're trying to maybe separate out soul and body, and we will prioritize the soul and disregard the body or call it sinful. And this integrated perspective helps me to, you know, see myself as, yes, a person with a disability and an aunt, and someone who loves the church and is passionate about social justice, and, you know, all of the things that make me me and who God has made me to be. And so that's one thing that I've really come to love about the Lutheran Church in my time as a part of it. And so I don't know if that's so much that that this is impacting how I show up in the Lutheran Church, or if it's just the Lutheran Church has given me this gift to be more open to all aspects. And, you know, I too have also experienced the uninvited requests to pray for me. And I was actually just discussing this with my best friend because she is someone who is deaf, and she has 2 children with autism who have pretty high needs for support. And her son, her son was just sort of prayed over by complete strangers, and it infuriated her and it infuriated me. And her husband, not so much, but he is someone who doesn't have a disability. And so there was a piece of the prayer that really made him mad. But yeah, so it's just, and I, in my younger days, I didn't really have the language to put to I guess to resist those prayers. So I always consented to them, even though I knew that people were not seeing me in my wholeness and my fullness. And so now I've got the language, and now the request to stop for the most part, which is, thanks be to God, I've not experienced this in the Lutheran Church yet. But yeah, that's what I'd like to add.
Shanti, did you want to address this question or say anything else?
After listening to all of you, I really want to thank you for sharing your perspectives. I can talk about myself a little bit. I grew up deaf. My father's side of the family is generationally deaf. Church. My parents were devout Christians. I was not. I decided that I couldn't live through their faith. Years ago, I decided to adopt Buddhist traditions. This seemed to match the need to grow for myself. And with respect to everyone's journey, respecting everyone's journey, honoring everyone's journey, including yourself. Like I said, growing up in the Christian church, I would often ask my parents to have an interpreter or try and get an interpreter provided. And they always wondered why. They said, I can lip read so well. Why would I need an interpreter? But I can't. That wasn't something I could do. You know, if not, then she wanted to just, my mother would just write me notes or tell me what was going on. And I just felt that wasn't fully inclusive. And I wanted to understand and belong like everyone else did. And that wasn't happening. So I felt a strong disconnect, and it was just not the best experience. As a deaf person, I remember meeting so many other deaf people and how our lives were just so completely different. They were never the same. I didn't consider myself disabled. I consider myself abled. And I did know that, you know, deaf and deafblind people were oppressed, you know, for their entire lives. And that was hard. But within the deaf community, you know, there are smaller sections where you can develop bonds with. One second. And it's easier to acknowledge their experiences around people that were so similar to you. So the internal biases, of course, were out there all the time. But a lot of these things were not visible to the eye, especially being deaf. So many different needs, it's really easy for me to forget that people don't see it. You know, for an example, like you were saying, if there's a picture that is being shown, I might need a description of it. Or like my background in the back is blue, because I learned that deafblind people prefer blue as a background compared to black or anything else, so they can see the sign language, their hands, in contrast to the color in the back. Language is really important too, you know, and you have to pay attention to how it's used. Regards to ableism and deafblind people and being disabled, language is really important. I understand that I am responsible as well for certain things. And privilege often comes up. And also discussing about BIPOC deaf people and language deprivation is has a huge impact on a lot of people as well. Back to language, it's just really important to be able to have that open dialogue, to be able to on each other's levels and understand a little bit more. So discussion is huge. And it's not always my job to take care of everybody else. For deaf and disabled people, who I work with a lot, I often ask them how they want to be identified, how they can be supported, how I can support them. And I sometimes, give them an example, to also let them know that they need to be accountable for themselves. And of course, it doesn't matter which denomination you are, which religion you are. The most important thing is just to recognize yourself, recognize your privilege, and see what you can do in your life to change and make things more equal. And also ask yourself why something might be making you feel uncomfortable. You're stuck with only what you know. And you really need to question your beliefs and question the system. That way, these internal biases, whether they come from schools or meeting people, your friendships, whoever it is, you just need to question yourself. And that's the only way you're going to learn, because holding it in is not going to help. So we are all responsible for unlearning certain things, unlearning behaviors, because knowing that it can hurt people should be enough. One second. Okay. So with your own dignity and agency, being able to use both of those to lead your life. Bottom line is, you need to have a discussion, start a dialogue, and talk about biases that you carry. And unpacking all of those biases that you do carry on a daily basis. So if you're with a church that is very inclusive and cares for their congregation, it needs to be inclusive. And that needs to be encouraged and spread amongst the congregation. Like I said, unpacking that bias, lots of conversation, lots of dialogue. And I like to work with people about being themselves and respecting that other people can also be themselves. That's the only way that movement can happen. So to provide the space for that discussion can become transformative. So as long as the church is aware of people, that's the only way it can be equitable. Thank you.
Thanks much. I am noticing that we are at the time that was originally designated to move to Q&A time. Currently, I'm seeing one question in the Q&A. So now would be a good time if you would like to submit a question to type it in the Q&A box. You should be at the bottom of the screen. There's a button called Q&A. Depending on the size of screen, you may need to widen your screen or scroll right to get to the button because it's usually last. Since we have one question and we didn't get to all the questions that were originally posed, my suggestion is we start with a question that's been submitted. If other questions emerge, great, we'll move on with those. If not, we can go back to some of the questions that we didn't get to from the start. Does that sound okay with folks?
I would say that with respect to integrating individuals into your congregation, large or small, the first thing is, in some respects, especially for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's in my opinion, it's the concept of welcoming and the concept of making that person feel like they're part of that community. If it's a child, talking to their parents identifying their needs, identifying the scopes of what they would like to have as being a member of the congregation. I would recommend something that I came across earlier today called canaccess.org, CANACCESS.org. And in that website, it is interfaith, interdenominational, and it has a series of questionnaires and other things that are available for utilization that, you know, you could send this to parishioners and they might identify individuals with disabilities, or the individuals with disabilities may choose to identify themselves. It's their choice. It's always their choice. I wanted to say one thing related to a comment I made earlier. Like, I said personally, when I work with individuals with intellectual or developmentally disabled individuals, severely disabled individuals, to me, they're like angels. That's my comment. I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying that that's how I feel. But you know what? I know they want to be treated as a human being, just like any other human being. We all want to be treated the same way, with the same sense of equality. None of us is more or less equal than another. The other thing I'd like to add is that, you know, I'm an attorney as well. And so I'm used to using phrases that are like person with disabilities, impairment, because those are legal connotations. So when I'm writing or I'm doing something, that I'm going to use that. But I don't identify per se as like a disabled individual. I identify as a person. I'm a person. And that's how we need to look at all of these things.
You know, Lisa, I'd like to respond by sharing with you a situation I ran into at Christmas time. There's a small congregation in Las Vegas, Nevada, called Holy Spirit Lutheran Church. You might want to give them a call. They have a member of their congregation who's deaf. She is African American and she's 9 years old and she's a Spitfire. And that congregation has totally embraced her. To give you an example of what they have done at their little Sunday school program for Christmas Eve, the little children were all down in the front and the teacher was down in the front on her hands and knees and she was directing their singing. And all of a sudden I realized she was signing the song to them and all these children were signing back. So as a Sunday school, they have taught sign language to all the other children. And I was so taken. My daughter took a video of that. And I'm just, but you know, those people at that church are absolutely fabulous. And if you gave them a call, I bet they would just dearly love to tell you how they went about and how they work on incorporating one person into their entire congregation. It was really beautiful to see. That's Holy Spirit Lutheran Church, Las Vegas, Nevada.
So I'm going to back up for a second here because we had made the commitment that we were going to read aloud questions before starting to answer them. So I'm going to back up and read the question that I think folks were responding to and ask that before we launch into a new question to just take a second and make sure we know what question we're answering. So the question that I think was being addressed came from Lisa saying, I'm going to summarize here, but how to best integrate folks with disabilities into the congregation, especially if there aren't a lot of folks with more apparent disabilities. And the example was of children and youth with STRON, and I'm intentionally using the word STRON instead of severe. Severe is a medical term. STRON is a term of community. With disabilities that may make communication difficult. And so I think that's a question that was being answered here. I'm seeing two other questions. A question from Jolinda. What impact is COVID having on each of you? And a question from Trudy about how to deal with some of the healing stories of Jesus in the Bible. For example, the healing of the bent over woman. Would folks like to address either of those questions?
May I first address the first question about how to incorporate people with disabilities in the congregation? And I'd like to say that one of the best things to do is to, if you can, talk to the person that has a disability directly to see how you can help them feel more welcomed. And if that isn't possible with that particular disability, you could talk to the person's caregiver or their parents with them in the room, never talking like behind them, but always making sure that your actions and your gestures are inclusive of the person with the disability as well. See, every disability and every person with a disability is different, and the needs are going to be different. So there's not a roadmap really to say, okay, you got this person do this, this, and that. Really, you need to be in relationship with the people that have a disability, and it's best if you can learn from them what would help them. But like I said, not everyone can express what they need, so the next step would then be to go and talk to a caregiver, but always remembering that you include the person with the disability as part of that discussion. Never talk about people behind their back. It's just very disrespectful.
Yeah, I think there's a theme emerging across our answers to a lot of questions about thinking about centering the ways of participating that are coming naturally to people with disabilities and to make that a valid way to participate, as well as really listening to and centering folks. One of the ways that we talk about it in the disability justice movement, which really starts from the voices of Black, Indigenous, people of color with disabilities, and transgender and queer folks with disabilities, is thinking about centering the most disabled folks, the most marginalized folks as the center of the community. So one of the things that I think about is like, how do we honor the ways folks are communicating, whatever ways those are? How do we make it the norm that folks vocalize and we're welcome to do that? And I think that for me helps us get unstuck from this problem of this is what church is, this is how we do church, to this is what church could be for everybody. Maybe other folks will want to vocalize too. Maybe that will allow folks who didn't feel comfortable come into church to come to church. And so thinking about some of those pieces. Did other folks have things that they wanted to say about any of those three questions? And I'm specifically noting that it sounds like Ashanti needs to leave soon. So if you would like to go next, if there's anything you'd like to say.
I would like to speak about the COVID question. I think it's going to have, it has had tremendous impact on my life as a person, but also providing services to people with disabilities. First of all, the access to medical care for people who have disabilities is oftentimes abysmal. Deaf people really are severely underserved by the medical community. So I will say that. And, you know, just the simple thing, for example, of like, obviously with COVID, you need to wear masks, but with mask, if you're without an interpreter there, which you might not have, you know, how could you understand what the people are saying to you? So there's not a way to effectively communicate. But on the other hand, COVID may also be something akin to the bubonic plague in the you know Middle Age or the medieval times. It was viewed almost as the end of the world, and that people come back to religion because of the effect of the plague. I don't know if that will happen, and I have no idea. But I just find that COVID right now is, you know, we don't know as a nation what is going to happen. And that, you know, has a great deal of impact, especially on individuals with mental health diagnoses. Will they be welcomed into various sectors of our society? Because they need to be embraced. And I don't believe that they will be.
Yeah, I'd like to comment to that too, Loretta, on the COVID thing. Yes, personally, it's been a huge thing. When you're in the vulnerable age group, you have to stay home. But, you know, I worry a lot about my kids. But one of the things that I've noticed that appears to be a real positive thing is that our church, of course, is doing live streaming, as are a lot of churches right now. And what we've noticed is that we are getting a lot of people coming on to the live stream and watching that. And we're hearing from people who hadn't been in church for a while. And so it's almost like we're really reaching, it appears to be a lot more people than we were before. We just need to know how to keep them coming when we can all go back. The other thing is that the young kids don't seem to be bothered at all by needing to do things on Zoom, because they're, you know, kids are used to that kind of stuff. So I think, like anything else, there's ups and downs and goods and bads, and we need to try to look for the silver linings, and people being interested in taking care of each other and helping each other is really a positive thing. And, you know, the other thing about COVID that I think is really an important thing we can't miss is it has raised the public consciousness regarding that systemic racism we've been talking about just kind of a little bit. And so all of those things taken together, just maybe we'll come out of this better than we went into it.
I'd also like to add one thing, that as a person with, I've lost a family member to COVID. And that it's an experience that I hope and pray that no one on this call will ever have to go through, or has gone through. But for those individuals who are in, you know, my group of people, the grief that you have is just insurmountable, because you don't have the ability to be with that person at their last minute.
Right.
You're alienated.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking that all churches may be needing to recognize that this experience needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
I think one of the things that is particularly many folks in disability community are talking about right now around COVID is that as our lives, as our bodies, as our experiences have never been valued, that means that we go to the bottom of the pile during times when crises take over and when resources are short. One of the phrases that folks are using is ICU, like the intensive care unit, genics. Eugenics is the practice of culling folks from the population whose bodies or minds are not valued, whether through hastening death or whether through not allowing folks to be born in the first place. And there are many examples of eugenics over time. It's something that has disproportionately affected folks of color, immigrants. Many of the tools that were developed had tie-ins with how disability was defined with those groups. And what we're seeing is that folks' quality of life, folks' desire to continue living is not being honored when disability is present. And as folks with disabilities, either due to our disabilities or due to needing to be in institutions, which is a whole nother story, institutionalization is super problematic in our communities for a lot of reasons. Infection control is only one of them. And I say institutionalization broadly because I don't just mean the state hospitals, I also mean the small group homes where people don't have control over their daily lives. That the dangers that disabled folks are facing right now are very large. And I think congregations can definitely be in the position of assisting with that, of advocating with hospitals to make sure that their policies are not discriminatory for end-of-life care, for COVID care with people with disabilities, for when a lot of times clergy and chaplains have different kinds of access to patients, and using that access to check in on folks to make sure that people's rights are being upheld, to make complaints with the hospital if something is happening in a way that it shouldn't be. There have been rulings issued clarifying that folks with disabilities who need personal care are allowed to have somebody with them in the hospital to provide those services that the hospital doesn't provide, whether that's a family member or a paid caregiver or both. But that right is not being honored in a lot of places, and that's leading to people being in unsafe situations as well. And what this adds up to is that folks from people of color, folks are experiencing higher rates of death and higher rates of infection in our communities and in other communities. I'm seeing that we still have a few minutes left. One of the other questions that's come up is about dealing with healing stories of Jesus in the Bible. Rebecca, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about COVID or about that question.
I don't have anything to add around COVID. That question though, about how to deal with healing narratives is one that I honestly, like, I've not figured out just yet. When I was in grad school, my theology professor did bring forward a text. We read just segments of it that was called The Disabled God, and really posited that Jesus in his resurrected form didn't come with a healed body, right, but came with a body that still had holes in it. And for me, it's more like I appreciate the attempt, but I don't necessarily need God to be disabled, sort of like disabled like me, right? But those healing texts for me are still difficult because they are not about acknowledging the wholeness of people that they already have, right? So if there are other pastors and theologians that can really help out there, I would appreciate it.
I'm happy to speak to this question. Pastor Brian, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Yes, I have a few things I'd like to say. As far as the healing narratives, I mean, it's something that we all struggle with. How do we interpret them? A good book that I've enjoyed is called A Healing Homiletic. It's by Kathy Black. She's a Methodist pastor. She takes the healing stories that are in the Revised Common Lectionary and looks at them and finds a more positive way to interpret them as opposed to some of the more traditional ways. And I'm sorry, it's been a while since I've been in that book, so I can't, off the top of my head, tell you what she suggests, but I just remember it being a really positive, really excellent book. My interpretation, though, of healing is Jesus was working to bring people back into community. And I think really that's where all healing leads, is to a fuller community. So if we can perhaps focus on that healing is about being a whole as a community, maybe we can get past some of the more particular details. I know it's hard to hear Jesus heal someone and say, go and sin no more, because then we get the people who say, well, obviously disabilities are brought on by sin. Well, that's not what we believe, but yeah, that's what I would do with that right now. I also, if I could have a minute just to address the mental health thing that we've been talking about. I think right now we in the church really need to be having conversations about mental health. It is something that is so stigmatized in our society that many people never talk about their mental health issues. And that leads to a lot of problems. These people are not getting the treatment that they need and deserve. I think we as a church need to be talking about it right now, especially during COVID. Pastors need to address it in the pulpit if they can. And we have a lot of resources actually to help us do that. If you are uncomfortable about talking about it, you don't know where to begin, may I suggest some organizations to you. We have a good working relationship with an organization called Pathways to Promise. They'll provide some great resources there. There's also Lutheran Suicide Prevention, another great resource. And I think in every community there should be, or almost every community, there should be a NAMI chapter. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We've worked with them. We've had grants go out where the partner organization with the church was NAMI. So we've done a lot with NAMI, even within the church. And then also LSS, a lot of LSS chapters, organizations also do mental health therapy and things. So there might be a resource in your community there if you're close to an LSS or whatever it happens to be called in your area. I know that they have different names in different parts of the country, but just check out those resources if you want to have more conversations. And we did have a couple of years ago put out an RFP, request for proposals, from the ELCA, and we funded a bunch of grants with organizations and churches doing mental health ministry. And over the last few months, we've been looking at some of the reports that have been coming back in from those who have done the grants. And the number one thing I keep hearing over and over again from those reports is people are saying, we want more. So if you start the conversation about mental health, people will say, we want more, we want to know more, we want more resources. So it's really been well received, the stuff that we're already doing. And I hope that we will continue to do more in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. You said you had something else to add about the healing narratives?
Yeah, I appreciated what Pastor Brian had said about bringing people back into community. And so I've got a short little story that has become sacred to me in the way that scripture is, although it is not from scripture. There was a couple that I knew out in Chicago when I was doing my grad work, and they have a daughter who was born with disability and very dependent in terms of needing to be fed through a feeding tube and all kinds of things. And so when she was their first child, when she was a young child, the entire caregiving for her was really placed on her mother, and her father was working a lot, would leave to go spend time with friends, really kind of do everything to avoid home. And but then one night, they were Catholic, so one night there was a healing mass, and he took his daughter forward to the priest for healing, and the priest looked at him and said, "She is not the one who needs to be healed, but you are." And he took that in the way it was intended, and he was able to be restored to his family because he had been doing everything. He was grieving his daughter, really, and he was doing everything to avoid that grief. And after he was able to acknowledge that and acknowledge his own need for healing, then he could completely fall in love with his daughter and see her for the person that God had made her to be. So anyhow, that has been a healing narrative that has been really precious in my life.
Thanks. I would definitely echo that in my theological training, that restoring community has been one of the themes that comes up in many of the healing narratives. One of the things that I think about, having been both somebody in the congregation as well as somebody with the privilege to be preaching, is that I think who is in your congregation at the moment is something to seriously consider when we're addressing what, I apologize, I forget the name of the theologian, but who talks about texts of terror. Texts that have historically been used to oppress us, texts that could traumatize folks in the congregation. So an example is folks that have texts that have been used to legitimize violence against women or slaves. I think we need to really deeply, and I'm here seeing from Trudy Phyllis Tribble. Thanks for generating that name for me. That we need to think about the same thing when we're thinking about stories about disability. If you get the chance, it would be a great time to reach out to folks in your congregation that are having the experience of disability to ask about how people about what they would set text, as well as looking really deeply and carefully theologically in ways that question our 2020 biases in America about what disability means. And maybe it didn't mean the same thing back. I can tell you for certain it didn't mean the same thing back then. And so what did it mean then? And how does that inform how we think of this text? In conversation with what are people's experiences of this, and what are ways of talking, of choosing whether or not we use this text based on how it's going to affect people in the congregation today. And if we do use a text, how do we transform that story in a way that is going to liberate us from ableism as the problem rather than disability as the problem? I am seeing we are past time. Megan, did you want to close, or?
Sure, I can close us up. I just want to extend my gratitude to all of our panelists today, to everyone who took the time to listen to these conversations. We have our town halls every Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on our Zoom and on Facebook Live. And I think as a person who is very high functioning autistic, it's not a thing I normally have the opportunity to speak much about out in the world. And so I'm so grateful for these conversations and for the space that we've created. I think what it is reminded me of is that like most conversations, we need so much more time and listening for this space and to lift up some of the incredible diversity that is both in our church and outside of our church, waiting for us to become more welcoming enough for folk to be with us and for us to join them. And I kind of just want to like, this is the pastor in me, but I kind of want to just like end our conversation today by apologizing to anyone who has been told that their body somehow makes them less sacred, for anyone who has been harmed in a church setting, for anyone who has been had an unconsensual sacred activity performed near them, and also to celebrate our fabulousness. And so whatever the way you communicate that, I hope you'll share that into the world. I am grateful for you, and I'm grateful for this time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.